Welcome to Between the Vines. My name is Kevin Martin. I'm here with the rest of the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, Andy Musa and Jennifer Phillips Russo. We are back to doing our weekly updates. This is actually the second episode of season 2. The first one with the whole team here. So we're going to give you more of a, I think, general update of what we specialize in and what we see happening over the next year, or at least what we're focused on right now that we're trying to think is the most important issues that growers might face in the coming year. I didn't discuss this with the team yet, so I don't know where we're headed. I think Jennifer's going to kick us off with the first topic, or maybe it's Andy.
Well, first I want to put in case people are just listening to these at any point in time, that it is actually the beginning of December. So harvest is done. So I'm not sure if you're up to date listening to us on a timely manner or not, but we have finished harvest and now actually starting to do some bud hardiness work.
Yes, we are going to time these seasons with the end of harvest. So the end of season 2 will be the end of harvest, which is not necessarily date specific, as we really learned this year. So season 2 might actually be a little shorter. Hopefully we're done sometime in October, but with that.
It's actually December now.
Right. Yes, it is. Yeah, it's December.
So if you want me to kick it off, I can just tell you what is happening and viticulturally what we're doing is we have been grant funded to do a cropping level research and its effects on bud hardiness, both on native, hybrid, and viniferous varieties. We do it on Concord, Vignol, and Riesling. Excuse me. And we just started doing our data collection last week. So we're going to do weekly collections. We put them in our bud freezer, freeze them down. And at the point that the buds die, it releases a spike of energy, and that spike of energy is read by a thermocoupler. And then we can look at that data and let you guys know throughout the season where they're hardy to. So we started that, and we'll be posting the results on our website, LERGP.com. shortly. It takes a while to get up and running the first couple of weeks.
Well, that bud hardiness sort of falls right in line with what happened this season with the heavy crop loads. And as we were sort of talking before we got on this podcast, the team members, I was out this week looking at some vineyard blocks. Grower called me and wanted me to look at some of his vineyards and the wood, and some of it didn't look real good. Heavy crop loads in those vineyards. A couple of them, he had labor problems last season, so he couldn't get them hand pruned. So he was thinking about mechanically pruning them, and he just didn't get around them. So these blocks were unpruned. And then he had other blocks that he had pruned, but all of them had high tonnage, probably at least 10 tons of the acre. And then he said, what had also fallen on the ground. So probably a minimum of 10 tons, and some of those probably, 12, 14 tons or more.
The wood just wasn't ripening.
So, the wood in the unpruned blocks from last year really looked rough.
Wow.
A lot of dead stuff, a lot of shoots that didn't harden off. So he was worried about bud numbers.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Jen and Kevin, you've been seeing the same thing, but even in the vineyards that were pruned, since it was such a heavy crop load, wood looks decent in some of them, but boy, not as nice as in a lot of other years, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I have the opposite worry. Like you said, he's specifically worried about bud number. I don't see, a ton of buds. I think you see problems with wood, with ripening and things like that. But I think I'm more concerned that there's potential for vines to be overcropped next year, not because we have a large crop, but because we decreased vine size in some of these areas by so much. Right. And that's what it looks like to me, because the bud numbers look pretty reasonable in some of the vineyards I've been seeing. particularly in the hand prune vineyards, which is a very, obviously different than not pruning at all. So I don't know if that looked like the bud numbers to you were low, like so low that the vines would be undercropped, but that's not what I have seen, to be honest.
Well, there is a lot of dead wood in there too.
Yeah.
And the cane diameters were, they were a lot shorter than like you'd like to see, less than the
Right.
pencil. And then the wood color was not good at all either. So that sort of goes back to the point that Jen was talking about with these bud hardiness. It will be interesting to see in some of these vineyards, how hardy those buds are. That issue might come up.
Yeah, it's, as you're talking, not that I need to put more work on my plate by any means, but the vines that I'm actually testing, we take very good care of, and we make sure that they are balanced. And yes, we are shooting for an overcrop situation, and that's the whole reason of doing this research. But the ones that I'm taking all of, the wood looks good. I'm not having any issues. So I was just thinking maybe I should contact that grower that you were speaking of and just try to do some bud hardiness on that as well, just to see the difference between that spindly unhardened wood and what we're going.
It might be interesting, like you said, you don't want to add any more on your plate, but it would be interesting to see.
I mean, don't you have some of that, Jen, with your cold hardiness, or is that done? Not specifically his, but.
Yes and no. So we are looking at some of Terry's where he did that differential thinning trial. We're going to start looking at that. I haven't been over there to see what the wood looks like, but just glancing around the research farm at Claro, the wood looks really good. I would like to find where the wood doesn't look so good and maybe test that. Because yes, we do have over and undercrop situations, but all in all, the wood looks, it's all hardened off. So
yeah, and sometimes there's a commercial grower or two out there for sure that has a different definition of overcropped.
Yeah.
Well, there was a researcher when Jen started writing up this project to do it that said something along the lines of, and they have a lot of experience in wine grapes, of, unless you do something crazy like defoliate at veraison, you're not going to see huge differences, because you just have to create so much vine stress to see a lot of difference in bud hardiness. At least that was his experience in wine grapes. And my thought was, this is worthwhile research, because I think we can find some Concord growers that create that level of stress. But we'll see. That's why I think it's interesting.
I was driving around the belt 2 days ago, looking around, and it makes me so sad that there are blocks of fruit just hanging, just stuck on the vines there. Interesting. I should head there to see what the wood looks like.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, and most of that where you see it hanging, I think, was probably bricks related.
Right.
One of the things that did happen is there were some tonnage contracts that got filled, but I think enough of that tonnage contract that got filled where there was a surplus was completed early enough that like the cash market was all wrapped up by the end of October. Like anybody doing tonnage contracts, they were done by October 28th. Gallo was done, I think, by the 15th of October. So the secondary cash markets were open far later. And so I think there were opportunities for growers to get new contracts to sell that fruit, because there was demand, I think, for a lot of Concord. I think we've talked about this. There just wasn't the space at certain facilities. And so that's what happened, is things moved around to fill up all the tanks instead of just tanks at one facility or another.
I have a question in regards to that. And I know we've touched base on this before in the past, and the Finger Lakes has that classified. Is it just who you know when you filled your contract at somewhere else? Is it just, in regards to who to call for the cash market? We don't have a classified out here saying.
Well, you're not going to sell Concords on the classifieds. The classifieds is for less than a truckload, or maybe a truckload. As far as I know, maybe I've seen slightly higher volumes than that, but we're talking about, maybe one juice grape processor wanted an extra 500 or 1,000 ton, and a couple growers or one grower can fill that. So that's where field reps come into play, and that's the contact point between a processor and a grower, and they work actively if they need to. We've been through a period where there was a surplus of Concords, and basically then the role is growers call up those processors and those contact points and mention that they have extra fruit, and nobody's interested in taking it. So it's really just an answering service. But for the most part, I think growers know who those people are. And for better or for worse, there's less flexibility than there could be in this market, because you're not going to move stuff into cooperatives, because there's timing involved with that takes place typically almost a year in advance if you're not already a member. And if you're expanding your membership, it's still certainly not going to happen in August, September, October, November.
People are scrambling.
Right. So that market isn't open to scrambling. As I mean, in my experience, maybe they did something in the past before I started, but typically it's not open.
Got it.
So one of the questions I had heard, and this might relate to some concerns about bud numbers, I think growers, for the most part, except for, growers who still have fruit on the vine, were very happy with the performance this year, and they're anticipating that their checking account might be healthy, or their business account might be healthy. But you look at small yields going forward and very high fertilizer prices, what do you do? So just a really quick update. Things have changed, but also things have not changed. And what I mean by that is we continue to get updates on fertilizer prices, and they continue to trend upwards. So we started talking about this in July. And as an example, potash was $563 a ton in July. And that was a concern because last November it was $340. So since July, it went from $560 to very close to $800 a ton. Since our update last week, it went from in the range of $750 to $775 to $775 to $800. So it's up another $25 in the last week. Since harvest, and we mentioned this last week as well, nitrogen sources such as urea have been what are really moving. Looking back at July, they went from 350 to 500. And then right now, so they were basically tracking potash prices. And now they've gone from that 500 to, for example, with urea, 875, 900 a ton. And since our last update, they're up about $75 a ton. Other sources of urea that we don't normally use, like anhydrous, typically are a cheaper source of N when you look at it per N, because they're not used in some crops. They're not as widely used. They're more difficult to use. So that was $427 a ton. You're looking back a year ago, and it's $1,300 a ton now. It was $1,100 a ton last week, and it's basically doubled since July as well. So these are some pretty dramatic increases. I've heard that some growers are considering waiting. All I would say is I have no idea what the future holds. I can only say that the trend has been mostly straight up for about 18 months, maybe 24 months now. And it's really just a question so far on this trend, how much it went up since last week. Sometimes it doesn't go up at all, and sometimes it goes up a lot. It doesn't go down, and that hasn't happened. That's not to say that it will. It's just a lot of times markets like this, something needs to happen for it to reverse course. People start to accept the fact that this is the trend, and no news now will probably mean equal to higher levels of price. if something happens, like the price of corn craters or the stock market crashes. But I think at this point, for example, for urea to fall below $500 a ton, there would have to be something major going on in the economy for that to happen, which is going to happen at some point. It's just, is it going to happen before you need urea this spring? I have no idea.
You know, I was, as you were talking, recalling some of the work that Dr. Terry Bates has done. They did a nitrogen trial, nutrition trial, where they put on 0, 50, and 100. I'm not sure if they had 30 in there, pounds per acre, and then measured vine size. And they said that 50 is optimum. If you put over that 50 on there, you're just basically throwing your money out. You don't need 100 on there. In regards to that, if you have organic matter, so I'm just thinking as we're talking about prices getting higher and higher, do a soil test, see where your organic matter lies, because it's going to be a lot cheaper than paying for all of the urea that you're talking about, at least what we're seeing right now. Each percent of organic matter is equivalent to 20 pounds of N. So you have 3%, there's your 60. You might not have to put it on this year. I would go ahead.
And that's the exact question. Like I said, we were talking about, before the podcast, that grower contacted me, and exactly what you were talking about, Kevin, that he was debating whether or not to buy urea at this time because of the cost. And he was thinking that it would go down, or at least he was going to gamble for it to go down. And so he's going to wait on buying it. And I told him, I have no idea. I don't have a crystal ball. So his guess is as good as mine. But like you said, Jen, a lot of these guys could definitely, since the prices are so high, cut back. And, this one particular grower, I think, was used to putting on 100 pounds of actual. So like you said, if he went down to 50, that at least cuts his cost in half.
Right. I don't say go willy-nilly. I really think you should know what your soils are. So
yeah,
for your vine. So do some soil testing and figure that out first. But
yeah, Andy, the one thing I would say is you look at potash. Potash has been 25% higher than this before, and it was a while ago. I think urea, I can't remember the exact number, but I think in the area of 30% higher than this is what that peaked at the same time or similar time. So there's certainly room and history behind farmers paying more than this for fertilizer. So I'm not saying it's not going to go down. For most of history, fertilizer has been cheaper than this. So one would expect at some point it might go down some, unless the whole market moves up in terms of inflation. But there's certainly potential for it to continue rising. We know that it can because it has before. So I would not take that bet with something like potassium after a year that we had.
I was just going to say that.
I would be concerned that prices will be 30% higher, and then the grower will be deciding whether or not to buy at $1,000 a ton, or they will be deciding not to put it on at all. And then they will see, I'm not saying they'll see it next year for sure. I don't know. But what we see with potash deficiency is sort of a horrible thing when it comes to the bottom line. Like once it hits, it's not good.
And the size of the crop that was out there that removed.
I think you can have more interesting discussions about short-term changes in phosphorus and urea. And those may need to take place because of prices. But I also think, at least with urea, I know not all, but I think a lot of growers have already made those changes. And just because urea went to $250 a ton, they didn't start putting 100 pounds on again. They decided that 50 or less was effective. So even if it's only $25, why waste it? But yes, that's how I would manage it. I would come up with a number for what I thought was minimal on my farm based on a soil test for each fertilizer, and that minimal maintenance number, I'd buy that now. And anything beyond that, like a maintenance number that I'm more comfortable with over the long term, or even a building number, that I might hold off on a little bit. if I was going to hold off on anything.
I think that's sound advice. But you had said something earlier about the risking the prices coming down, Andy. And all I could think about was how about those who risked us having a sunny September and October and pushed your vines a little bit. Oh,
I do have a couple of other things. I think Andy was talking about a labor crunch on one of those farms. We're starting to see more farms go to H2A workers, and the farms that have some experience, and there aren't a lot of farms that have some experience in our region with H2A, but the ones that do have larger crews this year. There was also, and I will have the link in the description so you can see it if you want. As it relates to New York State, there was a study released on the effect of overtime for farms. And there might be some confusion about H2A workers. So H2A workers are exempt from a lot of the extra costs associated with labor, like the benefits, because they're not here. So they don't need things like Social Security. They don't need things like unemployment insurance. All these things are mandatory in New York. They're mandatory for large growers in Pennsylvania. So there's some cost savings realized to switching to H2A, which helps you stomach the $15 an hour plus housing and transportation. When it comes to overtime, where that is required, which is in New York State, you are still required to pay overtime. I think it's a common misconception, or there might be some misconception about it, because it's a lot easier to manage an H2A crew, so it's a lot easier to avoid overtime. So right now in New York, we're at overtime for anything over 60 hours and anything over 7 days in a row. So that seventh day is a day of rest. We've talked about this on the podcast. I don't want to get into some of the crazy examples to really explain it. I think that's another discussion. But those are the rules: 60 hours, 7 days. So you just, when it's H2A, it's easy. It's 6 days, it's 60 hours if you're trying to max them out. And you just tell them that's what they're working, and you're providing their transportation from housing. So it's really easy to make sure they don't work 61 hours or they don't work 7 days. One of the takeaways from that study was if it went down to 40 hours instead of 60 hours, something like 80% of farmers said they would just get more H2A workers and cap it at 40 hours and manage it that way. And almost 80% of H2A workers surveyed said they just go to another state. So,
oh dear.
well, of course they would, right? Why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
They're here. There's nothing for them here. All they want to do is work. That's the point. I think we probably all had a point in our life where our time is not the priority. I mean, for some of us, maybe we were in college and it's like, all I want to do is work right now. There's nothing else going on. And that's what they want. So that, they're not willing to cut 20 hours just because they're not working as hard. And they don't necessarily care about the overtime pay. They just want to get paid flat rate, but that may not be an option going forward. So that's going to be very detrimental to the H2A program. The way that recruiting is effective right now is their understanding is that they're going to bring home about $15 an hour for about 60 hours of work per week. And so when you change that math considerably, they can just go to Pennsylvania and do the same thing. And they won't make quite 15 because each state has its own adverse wage, but they'll make close to 15 and they'll be able to work 60 hours. Or I think more in Pennsylvania. Yeah, they'll be able to work more in Pennsylvania. I think there is a cap on how many hours a week H2A can work. That's a federal rule, but there is no overtime rule. So, that's going to be detrimental, and that's something to consider going forward. Essentially, the way that works is that 60-hour is set in law in New York State, but there is a committee that's able to change it, and they meet annually to see if there would be adverse reasons for changing it. So their goal is probably to lower it, if they can lower it without, I think the theory is without destroying agriculture. So they're certainly going to be tempted to lower it. It's just a question of are they going to go to 40 hours? Are they not going to change it? Are they going to go to 55? And I think that's where I think a lot of farms are concerned. But,
When are they going to make that decision?
the hearing is in December. I don't have the date. I'll include a link to that in the description because these are open hearings. I believe they're still all virtual. So if you want, you can submit your comments as a grower.
Or are they? Has anybody heard about the weather coming up? Not that I'm changing completely, but I'm looking out my window right now and there's snow on the ground and it's slightly falling. I heard it's 60s this weekend. Has anybody heard that?
No,
No,
I didn't know that.
I was like, what?
Okay.
That means the college students in my town will be laying out studying for exams.
Because it's 60 and raining, they're going to lay out and enjoy the sun.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, when in college, enjoy. No, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if it just seems like it's been a weather pattern that's been going on for like a year, where it's just unseasonably warm, not necessarily dry. Seems like it's been going on a long time.
Does. Well, I don't have anything else.
I don't either. Well, I do have one thing that I'm going to be working on. I don't have anything finalized yet, but it's a takeaway from harvest this year. If you recall back, I think we did a podcast, and I know I did a newsletter article because there's a lot of. I've taken a look at bulk harvesting, and when I take a look at bulk harvesting, I say, hey, look, it's more efficient. And then basically what the article is about is these are all the assumptions I'm making to assume that it's more efficient. Like this is how many hours it takes you to do X, Y, or Z, and this is what these things cost, whether it's loading boxes on a truck or it's running a harvester for however many hours. And we start to see assumptions like the harvester goes a little bit faster with less downtime when the harvest production is geared towards bulk. And we start to see things like less labor involved, less, not only the downtime creates labor because everybody stands around, or the crews are smaller. So one of the things I focused on was something that hadn't really happened, which was the adoption of bulk in smaller operations, because we have over 300 people harvesting grapes in our region for 30,000 acres. So we have a whole bunch of people harvesting less than 100 acres of grapes. So what is the path to bulk in that situation when you're so small that you shouldn't have even bought a harvester in the first place? But we know you did because there was an inexpensive used harvester, and that's what made it make sense. So what is the path to go bulk? And so I made some assumptions and came up with some scenarios, and I'm happy to say that the grower, and I think I mentioned this on the podcast last week, the grower really pretty much beat those assumptions. So my assumption was if you were really close to a processing facility, you could get by with one truck, and that cuts your costs in half, because I don't think before this I knew any grower that actually had one truck. They had 2 trailers, which means 4 bulk containers, which means $50,000. So if you can cut that to 25, it dramatically changes who can adopt. So I thought, if you're close to Westfield, you drive the truck to the plant, you empty it, you go fill it up, and it's not that hard to pick 2 loads a day. And in doing that, that opens you up to much larger operations, because if you are harvesting 2 loads a day, it means you can harvest, maybe 14 loads a week, which means you can harvest 60 loads a year, which means you're a fairly large operation and you can probably afford even more than one truck. So that means the breaking point works at no matter the scale, because if you're big enough to need 2 trucks, you can afford 2 trucks. And if you don't actually need 2 trucks, you can just get one. So this grower did this, and I think the most impressive thing to add is this grower did this from Niagara County. They had 1 truck, they had 75 acres, and it worked. they were able, when they needed to harvest 2 loads a day, they could. Now, they didn't harvest 2 loads every day, and a lot of small growers don't harvest 2 loads every day, because if they did that, they'd be done the second week of harvest. But a third of this acreage is Niagara's, so they did harvest 35 ton, on average 35 ton a day throughout the course of the short Niagara season. So they were able to average about 1.5 loads a day during the Niagara season. And in the Concord season, they could pick 2 loads when they needed to or wanted to, and other days they would just pick 1. And by the end of the season, they harvested around 750 ton with 2 workers that were both unpaid, working less hours per day than they would have if they weren't bulk. So the 2 workers also worked less hard, and the total investment was, he didn't tell me what the total investment was, but theoretically, based on what these things cost, the total investment was probably in the neighborhood of $35,000. And
Wow.
it enabled him to not find a worker, because he was unable to find a worker to load the bins onto the trailer. And it enabled him to keep his labor at 0, which had the added benefit of not managing payroll during harvest, which, for a large operation, that's not going to happen. But for small operations, that's what they're used to. They want to keep it that way. And this allows them to do that as their labor pool, gets overworked if they go through a period of growth or something.
Kevin, as you're talking, and I know that we've discussed this as a team before, but I think that we should have a grower panel, like sort of a round table, invite these people who have adopted it, even the H2A workers, the ones who have adopted H2A, and just sort of sit around and answer questions from growers.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure, I'm sure growers would be happy to do that, because they also see benefits that we don't really need to get into what those benefits are, but benefits of more people adopting bulk. So they feel like their risk, or their risk during harvest would be lower if everybody was bulk, or if more people were bulk, whether it's, helping people out with harvest or helping people out with trucking. That becomes more challenging when you're running 2 different systems. And we've seen that a little bit where, growers can't take grapes to certain processors, or they're not set up to help somebody harvest because they only do bins, and vice versa. So they really, I think a lot of the growers that have adopted want other growers to adopt. Not just because they, I don't think it's completely altruistic. I do think that's part of it, is they make this transition and it works better than they thought it would, and they want other people to enjoy that, but they also want probably to help themselves as well.
That might be a segue to talk about, we are having our grower conference this year. We are doing it a little differently. This last year, we combined efforts with Bev. The year before that, we were in person. Not sure exactly if we can be in person this year, but we are planning on that in March. But we are going to have 2 virtual sessions, all for the same price. You get all 3 sessions for one price. One in January, I believe we said, and it's going to be a shorter amount of time. I don't want to quote it right now and somebody get back to me. Did we say 3-hour time? Or 2?
2.5 or 3.
2.5 or 3.
Something like that. But again, we're not going to ask you to sit around all day.
Right. It'll be one day. We'll have some speakers, and then the same thing in February, all virtual for that 2.5, 3-hour session. And then hopefully in March, things will be okay for us to be in person at SUNY Fredonia. So
if for some reason March is not in person, I think we haven't really talked about how we would replace that content, but if you guys have suggestions when we get closer, if it looks like that would be a problem, we will ask for those suggestions. Whether we change that to 1 session or 2, because that in-person one is going to be very close to what it used to be, in that it was a full day in-person program, and we would like to keep that very much a full day if it's in person.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. This was Between the Vines. And again, I think we've solicited some specific questions, but it will be a long winter if we don't hear from you at all. We will be working very hard to guess what you think is interesting. So this is our general plug for please contact us in any way that is convenient for you with all of your questions, whether you want them on the podcast or not. And that would give us some great ideas for future content. And also, we'd love to help you answer your questions and help you out on your farm with whatever is your most pressing issue. So again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.